The Mississippi Delta had always been a land of whispers. September of 1859 arrived with a deceptive serenity, the kind that cloaks horrors in plain sight. Sunlight filtered weakly through the dense cypress trees, casting long, skeletal shadows across the soggy earth. For those who walked these plantations, life had always been measured by obedience. But for Esther, a girl whose laughter had once floated freely in the lands of Yoruba, the air carried a scent she could never forget, fear mixed with the metallic tang of blood. At 15, Esther had been torn from her home, her mother's prayers trailing behind her like a desperate wind. Shackled and shipped across the Atlantic, she was thrust into the belly of the South, where cruelty was taught as easily as breathing. Her captors, the planter class, saw her as nothing more than a tool, a body to be used, a spirit to be broken. Yet, in the marrow of her bones, Esther carried something indestructible, knowledge passed down by generations, the kind of wisdom that could heal but also dismantle. She had been trained in herbs that could stop a fever in its tracks, in chants that could summon the body's own defenses, and in the intricate art of midwifery. Among the enslaved, she was whispered about as the miracle midwife, the one who could bring life where death lingered like a patient shadow. Her hands had saved countless lives, including the children of those who believed themselves to be her masters. Irony, however, never came sweeter than when it tasted of vengeance. The night her daughter was taken, Esther's world shifted from survival to something far more dangerous: resolve. Her little girl, barely 6 summers old, had been playing near the edge of the river when overseers, drunk on power, deemed her a nuisance and a lesson to be taught. By the time Esther reached her, the life that had shone so brightly had been extinguished. She held her daughter in trembling arms, the warmth fading, and the silent Mississippi mocking her grief. Something inside her snapped that night. The healer who had only sought to save now swore she would bring reckoning. Her first act of rebellion was quiet, subtle, a tincture here, a poultice there, but it sowed the seeds of fear. She worked tirelessly during the day, serving the same hands that had caused her unimaginable loss, all the while memorizing every route, every guard rotation, every flaw in the plantation's routines. And at night, she whispered to the spirits of her ancestors, learning to draw on power that had existed long before chains or soil had been stained by oppression. By 1859, Esther had mastered her tools, scalpels honed to surgical precision, herbal concoctions so potent they could bleed a man without leaving a mark, and knowledge of anatomy that her captors never suspected a mere girl could wield. She waited patiently, observing the routines, studying the weaknesses of men who had grown arrogant in their belief that life belonged to them. It was a dangerous dance. One misstep, one glance of suspicion, and she would be caught. Yet the more she studied, the more meticulous she became. Her rage was no longer blind. It was calculated. The plan began with small acts that seemed coincidental. An overseer who prided himself on his unyielding strength found himself crippled by a mysterious fever. Another, crueler than the rest, slipped in the wet mud near the stables at an hour when no one should have been watching, and did not rise again. Whispers began to ripple through the plantation, tales of a healer who could curse the body and bend fate. But no one suspected Esther. To them, she was merely the obedient girl who mended their wounds and delivered their children. Then came the night she decided to strike decisively. The moon hung low, a blood-tinged crescent, and the air smelled of wet earth and decay. 5 of the most ruthless overseers had gathered near the slave quarters, boasting loudly of their dominion, oblivious to the storm that had been quietly gathering in the heart of a woman they had crushed. Esther moved like a shadow, her presence unnoticed until it was too late. Each movement was precise, every step measured. The tools in her hands were extensions of her will, instruments of ancestral justice that demanded more than mere revenge. They demanded recognition of a spirit that could never be broken. The first scream cut through the night like a knife, echoing across the delta. One by one, the overseers fell, each mutilation deliberate, a signature of the pain they had inflicted on innocents. Esther worked with a cold detachment, her grief transformed into a force that neither time nor blood could temper. In the chaos, she vanished into the swamps and forests that she had memorized during her forced labor, leaving behind only a trail of fear and a lesson carved in flesh. No cruelty goes unanswered. By dawn, the plantation was silent. The men who had been invincible were gone, and the enslaved whispered of Esther's wrath, her name spoken in reverent fear. Yet Esther herself was gone. She melted into the Mississippi's thick fog, a phantom guided by ancestral knowledge, disappearing as suddenly as she had enacted her judgment. To this day, locals claim that the swamp carries her spirit, that anyone who dares to tread where injustice reigns may feel the cold brush of her revenge. And so, the tale of Esther began, not as a story of survival, but as a saga of calculated justice, of a healer who turned the instruments of life into tools of reckoning, and of a woman who vanished into legend, leaving behind a question that haunted the Deep South for decades. How does one measure the cost of stolen life? And who dares to claim dominion over another soul? The Mississippi Delta had learned a lesson that no amount of chains could teach. The healer was out there somewhere, waiting, watching, and perhaps, in some dark corner, ready to rise again should injustice ever walk the land. The dawn was gray, the kind of color that seemed to leech the world of hope. The plantation sat in eerie silence, broken only by the occasional caw of a crow perched on the skeletal branches of the cypress trees. Inside the slave quarters, the survivors huddled together, whispering her name, Esther. No one had seen her leave, no one had seen her strike, but the devastation spoke louder than any eyewitness. The 5 men who had once ruled with brutality were gone, mutilated with a precision that defied human understanding. Their absence hung in the air like a living curse. Among the enslaved, fear was mixed with awe. Some claimed they had glimpsed her silhouette slipping into the swamp, pale as moonlight, with hands that glimmered faintly as if touched by spirits. Others said they heard whispers in the dark, chants in a language unknown, guiding her movements, granting her powers no ordinary woman could possess. Esther herself had not paused. She moved deeper into the marshes, through knee-deep water and twisted roots, guided by instincts honed from years of survival and the secret knowledge of her ancestors. She had a plan, and her plan was not merely revenge, it was a reckoning. The overseers had believed their violence was absolute, that the world bent to their cruelty. Esther intended to teach them that power taken through blood and fear could be undone by skill, intelligence, and the memory of those they oppressed. The first of the 5, known as Harlan, had been the most cunning. He had taken pleasure in the suffering of others, and his laughter had often echoed through the quarters at night, a reminder of Esther's own helplessness when her daughter was taken. She tracked him first, blending into the reeds and shadows, unseen. The herbs she carried burned faintly, their aroma invisible yet potent, capable of clouding a man's senses until he staggered blindly. Harlan's arrogance led him into her trap. By the time he realized danger, it was too late. His screams were muffled by the marsh, swallowed by reeds and fog, as Esther's ancestral knowledge worked with a surgical precision that even the most experienced doctors of the South would have envied. Meanwhile, the other 4 began to suspect that something supernatural had entered their world. Each disappearance was methodical, each death arranged with a signature that only Esther could leave. One found his prized horse dead, its throat cut in a pattern that mirrored ancient Yoruba symbols, a language he could not read, but one that filled him with inexplicable dread. Another awoke to find his quarters filled with herbal fumes that caused hallucinations of his own misdeeds, visions of the lives he had destroyed, until he was driven to flee into the swamp, never to be seen again. The psychological warfare was as important to Esther as the physical. She understood that fear could be sharper than any blade, more enduring than any wound. Her work was not merely killing. It was teaching the world a lesson in accountability. By turning her knowledge of anatomy, herbs, and human behavior against her oppressors, she transformed herself from a healer into an instrument of justice. Each act was deliberate, each strike a reminder that cruelty could not go unpunished. As the sun dipped low, casting orange-gold light over the swamp, Esther paused to consider her next move. She remembered her daughter, her small, fragile hands, the laughter that had once lit her world. Her grief was a constant shadow, but now it had transformed into a weapon. The forest itself seemed to bend to her will. Animals stayed silent in her presence. The mist thickened as she passed, and the wind whispered warnings that only she seemed to understand. It was as if the spirits of her ancestors had guided her from the beginning, ensuring that every step she took brought her closer to justice. But revenge, as she had learned, was never simple. The remaining overseers were beginning to coordinate, aware that something unnatural was occurring. They set traps, fortified their quarters, and increased patrols. Yet, every attempt to corner her failed. Esther's knowledge of the land, combined with the cunning learned from surviving years of enslavement, allowed her to navigate every obstacle. She moved like a shadow, striking and disappearing before any alarm could be raised. One night, she confronted the third of the five, a man named Silas, who had been particularly cruel to the children on the plantation. He had a reputation for sadistic games, forcing those he deemed weaker into dangerous situations for his amusement. Esther waited in the dark, listening to the rhythm of his breathing. When he came to the river's edge to fish, she emerged from the reeds. With one swift motion, she incapacitated him using a carefully prepared herbal concoction that rendered him unconscious but fully aware, tormented by the visions of his own guilt. By the time he regained consciousness, he understood that the world he had dominated had shifted. He was no longer the predator, but the prey. Through these acts, word of Esther's legend began to spread. Locals spoke of a healer who could both save and destroy, whose knowledge was centuries old, whose vengeance was as precise as it was merciless. Plantation owners whispered in fear. Overseers grew paranoid, and the enslaved dared not speak her name aloud, fearing that to speak it was to call her wrath upon themselves. Yet Esther's journey was far from complete. Though she had dispatched 3 of the 5, 2 remained, each more dangerous than the last. Their cruelty had been matched by cunning, and they had begun to suspect that Esther was no ordinary woman. They set fires, ambushed the swamps, and enlisted hunters to track her movements. But Esther was always ahead, her mind working faster than their violence, her skills sharper than their weapons. She had become more than human in their eyes, a spirit of vengeance, a force that the world had underestimated at its own peril. As Part 2 drew to a close, the tension reached a breaking point. Esther, standing at the edge of the swamp, her figure silhouetted against the pale moonlight, knew that the final confrontation was near. She had honed her skills, sharpened her tools, and embraced the rage that had once consumed her. The remaining overseers were closing in, their arrogance blinding them to the storm that had been patiently waiting for this very moment. And in the shadows, the spirits of her ancestors whispered encouragement, guiding her steps, ensuring that the reckoning was complete. By the time dawn broke again, the stage was set. The swamp was quiet, the air thick with anticipation, and somewhere in the mist, Esther prepared for the culmination of her carefully orchestrated justice. The hunters believed they were the masters of fate, but they had yet to meet the healer who had become the very embodiment of resistance, vengeance, and survival. The swamp was thick with mist, a ghostly veil that seemed alive. Esther moved silently, her body blending into shadows, her mind focused with razor-sharp clarity. 2 overseers remained, Jeb and Thomas, the cruelest men of all, whose arrogance had never known boundaries. They had survived the chaos of the first attacks, but tonight they would confront a force they could not comprehend. Jeb's laughter echoed across the wet earth, a foolish, triumphant sound. Thomas followed, confident that their numbers and weapons would finally crush the unseen terror. They had set traps, called hunters, and fortified every conceivable escape. Yet Esther had anticipated it all. She had studied their arrogance, their greed, the very rhythm of their cruelty. Every step they took into the swamp led them deeper into her design. As they entered a narrow clearing, the mist thickened unnaturally, wrapping around them like a living net. Esther emerged from the shadows, pale and still, her eyes glowing faintly with a fire that seemed not of this world. The two men froze, disbelief painting their faces. How could one girl, one healer, be everywhere and nowhere at once? Without hesitation, she acted. A cloud of herbal smoke burst around them, disorienting and blinding. Jeb screamed as visions of his atrocities replayed before him. Children crying, the faces of the enslaved he had tormented, and finally, his own death mirrored in grotesque detail. Thomas swung his rifle wildly, but his hands betrayed him. The swamp seemed to grip his muscles, slowing them, forcing him into a stumble. Esther moved like water, precise and merciless. By the time they realized the depth of her planning, it was too late. With surgical precision, she incapacitated Jeb first, leaving him writhing, fully conscious of the consequences of his cruelty. Thomas tried to run, but the swamp itself seemed to shift against him. Roots tangled his feet, mud sucked him down, and Esther's ancestral chants rose over the croaking frogs and whispering trees. She worked with calm detachment, yet each movement carried a message. Every act of violence he had committed, every life he had destroyed, was mirrored back upon him. The pain was both physical and psychological, a punishment that transcended death. As Jeb and Thomas finally lay defeated, the swamp returned to silence, but not before a final warning echoed. The healer was not to be underestimated nor forgotten. Exhausted but victorious, Esther did not linger. She melted into the fog, leaving no trace except the echo of her deeds and the whispered stories that would haunt the Delta for generations. She was no longer a captive, no longer merely a healer. She was a force, a living testament to the power of knowledge, resilience, and vengeance rightly served. The mist of the Mississippi Delta had begun to lift, revealing the skeletal remains of trees that bore witness to the horrors of the night. The plantation lay silent, almost reverent, as if the land itself acknowledged what had transpired. Esther moved like a shadow, slipping through reeds and swamps she had memorized from years of labor and hiding. She was neither hunted nor fearful anymore. The hunters had become the hunted, their terror woven into the very fabric of the land. She paused at the riverbank, water lapping gently at her ankles, reflecting the first pale hints of dawn. Memories of her daughter pressed against her chest like a weight, a grief that had once burned her spirit raw. But grief had transformed. It had become resolve, a guiding force. The river whispered promises of freedom, carrying her beyond the reach of those who had claimed dominion over her life. Esther knew she could not remain among humans any longer. The Delta had seen her wrath, her knowledge, her power, but she belonged to neither plantation nor town. She carried centuries of ancestral wisdom within her veins, a lineage older than the chains that had bound her. And now, with the final overseers gone, she could vanish into the world unseen, leaving only lessons behind for those who dared to oppress. As she drifted along the river, small villages whispered her name, the miracle midwife, the ghost of the Delta, she who delivers justice. Parents told their children never to wrong another, lest the healer come again. Even the enslaved, who had feared punishment for speaking her name, found courage in her legend. Esther had done more than revenge. She had reminded the world that knowledge, wisdom, and courage could not be enslaved. By nightfall, Esther had reached the edge of the forests, where the land met the sea. There, she used the last of her herbs to mask her scent and footprint, slipping aboard a small, abandoned boat that drifted like a promise into the horizon. Behind her, the Delta remained, haunted and humbled. Ahead, the ocean carried her toward freedom, toward a life unshackled by cruelty and toward a world she would never allow to see her exploited again. Yet her disappearance was not an escape from responsibility. It was a continuation of her legacy. Esther had delivered a message as sharp as her scalpels. Cruelty would not prevail, and knowledge was power. Those who had survived the night would live with the memory of her judgment etched into their minds, a moral scar that no denial or justification could erase. And the spirits of her ancestors watched, their whispers mingling with the tides, guiding her toward a new destiny while protecting the memory of the old. In the years that followed, the legend of Esther grew. Travelers spoke of a healer who could vanish like smoke, of a woman whose hands could save or destroy, depending on the justice owed. Plantation owners grew wary, and some even claimed the delta itself had become sacred ground, touched by a force they could neither comprehend nor challenge. For those who suffered under oppression, Esther's tale was a symbol of resilience and resistance, a testament to the truth that the powerless could rise with the knowledge of generations behind them. And somewhere, far from the lands that had once enslaved her, Esther lived, free, unseen, unbound, yet forever present in the moral reckoning of those who dared to exploit the innocent. She was not merely a woman. She was a warning, a memory, and an enduring symbol of justice, courage, and the unbreakable will of a spirit that refused to be conquered. The Mississippi Delta remained, holding its secrets, haunted by whispers of the healer who had defied the world, delivered her vengeance, and vanished. And in those whispers lay the deepest meaning of all. No chain, no cruelty, no stolen life is ever without consequence.